One day, I was sitting in class and my teacher asked a question. My classmates and I all just sat there. We stared at the wall or at the ground and we wondered, who's going to answer that question? Well, none of us did. That was until my teacher walked to the back of our classroom and grabbed out a bowl of candy. Almost instantly, the majority of my classmates' hands shot into the air, suddenly ready to answer that question. And over the course of the semester, I watched this become a habit for my class. In order for us to respond or participate, we had to be bribed with candy or other types of prizes. This really got me thinking about student motivation and motivation within schools. So I dug in and I did some research. I learned that motivation occurs because our brains form neural pathways that connect emotions and experiences. These pathways connect the positive feelings of success with the action steps we took to get there. These positive feelings of success are triggered by a hormone called dopamine. Dopamine is the hormone at work whenever we experience joy. And because we love these feelings of joy or of dopamine, we want to do whatever we can to get back to that place of success that caused them. So we refer back to our neural pathways, and we take steps that are the same as or similar to steps that have led us to success in the past. Now, motivation can be categorized even further than these basic neural pathways. There are 4 distinct types of motivation, each of which have a unique effect on our brain. The first type is intrinsic motivation. This is motivation from internal factors. An example of intrinsic motivation could be learning a language because you enjoy the process. The second category is extrinsic motivation, which is when your motivation is coming from external factors. An example of extrinsic motivation could be learning a language because it's required for school or for your job. Both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation provide us with a dopamine release once we've reached the goal of our task. However, the dopamine release triggered by intrinsic factors has proven to be more sustainable and long-lasting than the release triggered by extrinsic factors. This, in turn, causes intrinsic motivation to be much more sustainable. Moving to the third category, there's approach motivation, which is when the goal of a task is to gain something. Using a language as an example once again, one might learn a language using approach motivation if they were motivated to gain the connections with everyone who speaks that language. Finally, there's avoidance motivation, which is when the goal of a task is to avoid harm. An example of avoidance motivation could be learning a language to avoid getting lost while in a foreign country. Approach and avoidance motivation have quite different effects on our brains. Approach motivation, once again, causes a dopamine release, while avoidance motivation causes norepinephrine to be released and our amygdala to be activated. Norepinephrine is a stress hormone, and the amygdala is the region of our brain that processes fear-inducing stimuli. So this is a stressful state to be in. To restate and simplify, intrinsic motivation is long-term, while extrinsic is short-term. Approach motivation is positive, while avoidance motivation is negative or stressful. In our everyday lives, these types of motivation don't stand alone, but instead overlap and intertwine. The motivation for a task can often fall into more than one category. When this happens, we experience a combination effect of the types of motivation. The ideal combination is intrinsic approach motivation. And this is ideal because it's both sustainable and positive, causing us to have strong and large dopamine releases, which in turn lead to strong neural pathways being formed. These strong neural pathways make it easier for us to refer back to them, in turn making it easier for us to find those steps that lead us to success, making us both more motivated and more successful. Since intrinsic approach motivation can have such positive effects on us, it would be ideal if students were using it throughout their studies. Unfortunately, this is not currently happening. The current school system relies heavily on extrinsic factors. These factors are things like grades, awards, rewards, and prizes. And when we place such heavy emphasis on these factors, students often run out of motivation simply because extrinsic factors are not sustainable. When students run out of motivation, they often lean even more heavily onto those extrinsic factors, creating a vicious cycle where students are only motivated up until the next reward. For example, let's say a student was lacking motivation, and their teacher had made a promise of bonus points. That promise of bonus points re-motivated them, and so they worked really hard to earn those bonus points. Once they've got them, though, they revert back to that place of lacking motivation. This cycle can also cause students to fall into avoidance motivation, where they're trying to not lose something. Within a school, this could look like trying to not lose a grade in a class, or a privilege with your parents because of your grades. Either way, it's stressful and it's not conducive to learning. With this knowledge of both our school systems and human motivation, we can make changes to better our school systems. The first step in bettering our schools will be education. We must educate teachers and school leadership on how motivation works and how they can nurture intrinsic approach motivation within their classrooms. Students also need to be motivated. They must understand how motivation works so they can be active participants in the transition away from extrinsic factors. Next, we need to implement. We need to put these practices into place within our classrooms. An example of a practice that could be easily implemented into a classroom could be providing students with more choice on their assignments. It's not always practical to allow students to entirely choose their topics. But let's say the assignment was to analyze a speech. Why not provide students with 2 to 3 options of speeches to analyze instead of just one? By making this simple change, it will be much more likely that students will select a speech that interests them. This interest will drive them to use intrinsic approach motivation, because that interest is an internal factor, triggering intrinsic motivation. They will also feel as if they're gaining information on a topic that they care about, which will cause them to use approach motivation. Another practice that could be integrated into classrooms could be providing more interaction within a class hour. Often, classes for students my age look like going into class, receiving an assignment, and then working silently until the end of the hour. This leaves little to no room for interaction. And that is problematic because each interaction is a chance for success. And each chance for success is a chance for dopamine. This dopamine will re-motivate students to continue being engaged in the learning process. This dopamine rush will also tell the students' brains to pay attention, that something important is happening, which is again extremely beneficial to learning. The final change that we must make in order to better our school systems will be shifting our focus away from those extrinsic factors. Our culture has placed such heavy emphasis on extrinsic factors. Things like having the perfect GPA or earning the most awards. And this is why we're in the situation we are currently in, where we have classrooms full of students who stare blankly at the wall when asked a simple question. They are lacking motivation because those factors are not sustainable. So we must simultaneously decrease our focus on those factors while emphasizing the skills, knowledge, and connections that can be gained through school that will prepare our students for the real world. By doing this, students will be forced to find a more intrinsic, internal sense of motivation. By making these changes, we have the opportunity to transform our classrooms from the one where we started, where students stared blankly at the wall when asked a question, to one where students are excited to answer a question because they understand it's an opportunity to learn and to grow. They are excited to share about their interest-driven projects because they're passionate. And they understand that while at times important, grades are far from the whole picture. We can fill our classrooms with students who are highly motivated and highly successful. This will make them more prepared for the real world and allow them to have a better relationship with school. This is why I ask you to join me in working to make our schools a place that nurture intrinsic approach motivation. Thank you.